What's up, YouTube? We're going to do some benching today because it's a good day to do benching. So, gonna do another little warm-up set right here. Then we'll get into Psalm 44. I think it's going to be great. Yeah, that felt pretty good. So, Psalm 44, kind of interesting because you're going to get a person's perspective on sort of a exile situation. I don't know what the consensus is. I didn't look it up to see when this actually got written. But from what they're talking about, of course, it sounds like, at least one of the exiles, if not the first one. But it's also interesting when you think of it in context of, say, like the book of Judges, even as far back as that, when God told the people what his expectations were. They don't listen. And then the things he said that would happen when they didn't listen happened. Of course, all the blessings that he promised them for listening happened when they listened. So I guess they got complacent, they got lazy, all kind of stuff. But it's funny because this sort of how you always remember the good times when you look back sometimes, and then kind of forget some of the details maybe. Because he says, "We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what work thou didst in their days in the times of old." So, if you can't tell already, because I guess I can only tell because I've already read it, but he's sort of talking about, hey, back in the day when things were so good, not implying that things aren't good now, and he will say that later. How thou didst drive out the heathen with thy hand, and plantedst them. How thou didst afflict the people and cast them out. Well, we can go a little overboard sometimes on, and now I'm saying this with like such a grain of salt here. You can go overboard with how it's all God, and man, we almost don't. We almost do the opposite in our society. It's all us, but the reality is, some people will still take it to the extreme of like it's all God, like you're just going to sit there and do nothing when God has called you to go and do and to be obedient. That's part of his plan. Part of his will is you. And so this person's such highlighting what God did that it's almost like gives him a way to blame God then when things don't go right. As if our participation when things are going right, our obedience, and then our disobedience is what's led to things going wrong, and how those things are so tightly knit together. So have that thought in mind, because he says in verse 2, about how God did this and God did that. And he says in verse 3, "For they got not the land in possession by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them. And that's true. God says it in Judges that God drove out, and even before that, God drove out the enemy before them. But God still wanted them to go and do the work of the warring, the planting of the vineyards, the work, whatever the work was. And he seems to be kind of ignoring that part here. Says, they got not the land by their possession, by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them, but thy right hand and thine arm and the light of thy countenance, because thou hast favor unto them. All those things are true. He's not saying anything there that's not true. But he's leaving out the part about the obedience and the work that they did as they followed God into the promised land. Think about that. All right, so let's keep reading, see where he's going with this. Thou art my king, O God, command deliverance for Jacob. Through thee will we push down our enemies. Through thy name will we tread them under that rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, and hast put them to shame that hated us. In God we boast all the day long and praise thy name forever. Selah. So, Selah, that's that word. It means like pause and meditate. So, because he's building up to this word, Selah. And, oh, by the way, that psalm is written by not anyone in particular at this point in history. It's the whole thing with the sons of, the descendants of Aaron, and how each one of his sons had a specific job in the tribe of Levi to do certain things. And so, the one family, the one branch of the family tree, so to speak, was responsible for music. And then another branch of the tree was responsible for maintenance, cutting firewood for the altar and all that stuff. And then, different families, different branches of the tree, so to speak, all had different jobs. So this is not a David psalm. This is a psalm of that branch of the family tree of Aaron, the Levites. And so it was their job to, write songs and do music, which is kind of a cool gig if you ask me. But so they're looking at it, from this perspective, and they're looking at the past. But as I've just pointed out, they're looking at God and talking, and they're kind of humble bragging, I guess, like, man, we've been praising you this whole time, which was their job, by the way. So, I mean, in one sense, you could just say, we've been doing our job this whole time. And we've been, writing the songs. You did this and you did that. Your strength and your power and your might. They're totally leaving out that part about our obedience. That's going to come up in a minute, because look, if there was no historical context for this song, then it wouldn't stand out to me so much. But, we're going to keep reading in a second, and we're going to see where, as good as those first 8 verses or so sound, the fact that they're leaving out the obedience part, the fact that they're leaving out what God called them to do in Him driving out and preparing the land and all that stuff, it just really jumps out at you here in a second. So let's check that out in a minute. All right, so next little chunk here, you kind of see when you put everything on God, then you turn the coin over. And that's kind of what he does here. Or they do here. I don't know. It just doesn't say exactly. It was a group of them. So he goes, "But thou hast cast us off and put us to shame, and goest not forth with our armies. Thou makest us to turn back from the enemy, and they which hate us spoil for themselves. Thou hast given us like sheep appointed for meat, and hast scattered us among the heathen." Okay, let's stop right there, because that's a real specific thing that we know about. Scattered us among the heathen. So, well, he said that would happen if you disobeyed. All the stuff prior to the word Selah were the things that God did when the children of Israel were obedient. When they were doing what they were supposed to do, they were living in the promises, they were living in the power of God, and then everything was great. Then they got complacent, they got lazy, they took it all for granted. And again, just read, starting in Judges onward, this roller coaster spiral of God's patience, because he didn't look at the first time they sinned and Judges and completely annihilate them. In fact, he never did that. After all the times that they messed up, all the times they disobeyed, he has never fully annihilated his people, even though he would have every right to, because justice says, this is the deal we've made. We're going to follow God, and he's going to do all these things for us. And if we deviate, don't do it, then this is what's going to happen. Instead, he always I'm going to be merciful and gracious because I'm a loving God. And that's Old Testament because he's the same God. And but you see here, they're putting everything on him, and it sounds good up until the word Selah, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, guys. Those things are happening for a reason. It's because you disobeyed. It's very simple. So he says, "Thou sellest thy people for naught, and dost not increase thy wealth by their price." Like, you're giving us away for nothing. You're not even making money getting rid of us. So cheap that it's not even making you money. Well, that's not the point. Again, these guys, they're missing the point. They're doing this thing that I can't stand. It's called whining. They're whining. And it's funny because this is a psalm and we think beautiful poetry and da 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 da. But let's stop and think about, what they're actually saying, what they're referencing, what they're talking about, and read Judges, read the prophets, read First Kings and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, read the book of Daniel, you see Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra. Those are some specific books where you're getting some documentation of this whole thing. Man, just really kind of puts it in historical context so that what they're saying, you have an actual reference point for events. He says, "Thou makest us a byword among the heathen, a shaking of the head among the people. My confusion is continually before me, and the shame of my face hath covered me." Yeah, it's embarrassing when you lose and you lose and you lose and you lose, but it's like they've not wanted to look in the mirror and take responsibility yet for what they've done. And it says, "The voice of him that reproacheth and blasphemeth by reason of the enemy and the avenger, all this is come upon us, yet we have not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely with thy covenant." Well, that's a lie. Absolute, flat out lie. Because, again, we see it. They disobeyed. God was patient. He sent them prophets to warn them. And then what happened? They still didn't listen. In fact, sometimes the prophets got abused and mistreated. And then when Nebuchadnezzar comes, and different ones in the book of Judges in particular, I keep saying that book because you see it in little, God gave him these little warnings of it. A little nation would come in over here and only maybe mess with one or two tribes. That should have been the warning for everybody, and until it just didn't work. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes and just takes out the whole place, and burns it all, and takes everything, and all that good stuff. But they can't say they never dealt falsely with the covenant when their direct disobedience to the covenant is what has put them in this situation to start with. So they're delusional. They're like so many, of these delusional American Christians that think that we're something special when we're not even really directly mentioned in the Bible at all. I imagine America will be gone and forgotten at some point before Jesus comes back, if he doesn't hurry up and come back. But I don't know, because people want to get into some symbolism stuff and Revelation maybe. I don't know, but we're not this necessarily something special as far as that's concerned, unless it just becomes blatantly obvious at some point. So we're going to do some more benching and look at where these guys are going with this psalm, but so far it's not good. They just left us with a flat-out lie. Like, exactly dealing falsely with the covenant is why they're in the situation they're in. Now, are they going to come around and admit it, or are they going to continue in their delusional, their version of Judaism or whatever? I guess we'll find out in a second. yeah. That's getting heavy. Okay. Okay. Trying to do some math here. Chill. So hopefully you've thought about it and understand what I'm saying about what these guys are saying. In some ways, it's kind of sad that they would be that delusional about it, but it's to be expected these days. Oh, and those days too, apparently, not just these days. So he says, yeah, what a joke. We've not dealt falsely with thy covenant. Yeah, you did. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy ways. Very much so they did, actually. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons, and covered us with the shadow of death, if we have forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out, for he knoweth the secrets of the heart. I mean, they literally did that. That's what gets me, is they literally did that. I mean, that is why they got in the predicament they got in to start with. You know? And it's like, I get if in some weird way he's because he sounds like he's speaking, from the perspective of the whole collective, the nation itself, this whole psalm. But I understand as an individual, okay, if you are the one, you're the Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah of the situation. I get it, but that's really not what they're saying here. They're acting like, we're Israel and we've been perfect. Why is God letting these bad things happen to us? When all we have to do is just read the Old Testament. Like, this has got that, doesn't have that, but whatever. This is just a New Testament, but just figuratively go back and read. That's not what happened. It's a false narrative. And if they actually believe their own false narrative, they're crazy. Yea, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake, why sleepest thou, O Lord? Arise, cast us not off forever. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and forgettest our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, and our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. Okay, well, that's the thing. You're asking God to be merciful and gracious when he has so many times, and you still didn't listen. You still ignored. You still disobeyed. Did whatever you